breaking news with Washington State and Oregon State going up against the Pac-12. And a story we've been telling you about for the better part of about 4, 5, 6 days now. We've seen this coming. We told you on Friday that our sources were telling us this was a slam dunk for Washington State and Oregon State, and now it's come to fruition. A judge has granted Oregon State and Washington State a temporary restraining order against the Pac-12, which will forbid the Pac-12 from having a board of directors meeting this week, which the 10 other members that are currently still in the Pac-12 say was innocuous, and it was simply just to handle some payroll business. That's not what Washington State and Oregon State told the judge. They felt like this was going to be a board of directors meeting that would include a vote on splitting all of the equity and assets amongst the 12 members equally, which, of course, you understand from a 10-member perspective, and you understand why Washington State and Oregon State would not want that to happen. Well, a judge today sided decisively with Oregon State and Washington State. And now I think the question becomes, what happens next? Because this is a decisive victory. If that temporary restraining order had not been issued, Oregon State and Washington State likely would have very quickly found themselves insolvent athletically and likely would have had to have cut sports, likely would have had to join the Mountain West. It was a complete game changer if Oregon State and Washington State lost this temporary restraining order fight. However, they did not. The Pac-12 cannot have a meeting this week. Jake, how big of a win do you think this is for Washington State and Oregon State?
Well, I mean, obviously it's a huge win. I think it was a must-have. I think it was a situation where you had to have this in order to go down the path of having control of the assets and essentially ensuring your survival on some level. I mean, of course, you always had the Mountain West option, but I think that this victory allows you to stay on track for keeping the Pac-12 brand alive. Because, again, if you're not going to have control of your assets, if you're not going to decide how all that is sort of divvied up and how all that works, I just don't know how you keep control of the brand itself. You're no longer in a position to sort of forward push the survival, if you will. If you'd have lost today, it really would have reinforced the idea that you and Washington or in Oregon State would have just been jumping into the Mountain West under that brand. And I think that's what this truly is all about. I mean, sure, this is about pausing a board of directors meeting, but at the core, Washington State and Oregon State are trying to keep control of their assets so that they can keep, the money that the conference had saved over the years. They can keep control of the TV network, and they can keep control of all this stuff that they have.
I think the brand has value to it. I mean, if you're Oregon State and Washington State, I don't know that there's any way to save an automatic qualifier spot. I don't know. We'll find out about that as this news cycle goes on. But the value of this brand, in my opinion, is that you can market with it. You can readily put it in front of a college football fan, and they're going to be recognizable. That, to me, is the value of the brand. It's easier to get a TV deal under the Pac-12 umbrella than I think it is under the Mountain West umbrella. I think it just makes more sense financially to keep this brand alive. That's what they're fighting for at this point. Are they fighting for cash? Yes. Are they fighting for control of the Pac-12 networks? Yes. Of the assets, the trucks, the humans? Yes. But this brand, if it's dead, all of that is massively devalued. The cash obviously would have been split 12 ways. Like, this is in my opinion, this is a massive game changer. There's no way to spin the fact today that Oregon State and Washington State quite literally won their survival as a conference today.
Yeah.
Because in that charter, and the other thing I would remind you, in that charter, it specifically says, hey, if there are members remaining in the conference, the money stays, the asset stays. And what was the leverage point that Washington State and Oregon State used today in their argument in front of a judge to get this temporary restraining order? Well, what they said was when Colorado hopped, immediately the other members of the conference kicked Colorado off the board of directors, got them out of future business, got their voice out of decision-making. I think that's exactly what the precedent here is. And what this temporary restraining order says is that precedent matters. Past behavior in this exact situation by these 10 exiting members matters. And I think that was a very wise play by the attorneys representing Oregon State and Washington State, because I think it's a real hammer when you hold what people have done business-wise against them going forward. It shows you, well, how are you acting? Are you acting in your own best interest, or are you just following policy? I think these other 10 members were very clearly acting in their own best interest. I don't even know that you can argue that.
No, I don't think you can argue that. And how could you blame them? I mean, again, I feel like everyone quickly forgets the position that all of these schools, including Oregon State and Washington State, everyone seems to forget the position that you were put in. I mean, your best deal that you were offered was basically an incentive-laden sales package deal with a really low base salary, right? I mean, we're talking about 15 or 20 million here, and then you'd have to sell your way up to compete with the other Power 4 conferences. So yeah, I mean, I do think that the other schools were acting in their own best interest, as I would recommend them to, and I think this is why we get division in conferences. Like, this is why we get the four-corner nomenclature. This is why we get USC and UCLA, why we get Washington and Oregon. You notice geography matters. Schools that are close to each other tend to team up, and that's what I think is difficult here. I'm sure Washington State is salty about the idea that Washington got out of a crappy situation and into a better one, and they were left for dead. I mean, that's probably part of this. So that's why I say, I mean, if anybody was telling you that these 10 schools had any chance, honestly, to win today, I don't know what they were looking at. I mean, the case and the situation, lays out perfectly that Oregon State and Washington State would win today's court matter. Now, moving forward, I don't know. That really depends on just how well the 10 schools can fight. I'm not going to sit here and say that it's an auto win for Washington and Oregon State. Sure, do the bylaws and does everything on paper say that Oregon State and Washington State should win? Sure. But we're not just arguing about what's on paper, because it's not a what's on paper issue. It is a big picture, never before seen thing. And I think that's what people don't really want to talk about. We've never seen this in college athletics. So sure, yeah, if you leave a conference or if you leave the Pac-12, the bylaws say you're not on the board of directors anymore. That might be true, but yeah, I just think it's a complicated issue.
Yeah, I think it is absolutely groundbreaking for the new Pac-12. I think if this goes on, and now I don't see any way that the 10 remaining or exiting members, find leverage over these two remaining, Oregon State and Washington State. I mean, there's just no fight to be had at this point. I think what the natural order here is that these 10 remaining members are simply going to stand down.
Right.
And you're going to see a situation where Oregon State and Washington State make up the board of directors. I also think it's very interesting. Where was George Kliavkoff today? Well, he wasn't in a courtroom. He was in Montana, probably pruning trees. I have no idea what he was doing, but he was not involved in this. And as we've reported for the better part of 6 weeks now, George Kliavkoff is a paper pusher in this conference. George is not somebody that's involved in the future business of the conference. He's not somebody that's involved in sculpting or, making policy going forward. He simply is making sure that this current football, basketball season into the summer sports season through July 30th, June 30th, gets executed to the letter. And then, by all accounts, he's going to be terminated. And I think that's exactly how they should handle this. I also think that it's very interesting now that the board of directors in the Pac-12 is going to come down to 2 schools. And these 10 schools are quite literally just in business to make those 2 schools money. Because if you look at this past weekend, a strong performance out of USC again, a real decisive win for Oregon at Texas Tech. I think a gutty win for Utah in Waco at Baylor. This conference is still the best football conference in the country, and we're going to week 3 now. So it's no longer a fluke. There's a legitimate chance for one of these 4 schools in the Pac-12, and be that Oregon, Washington, USC, and Utah, one of those 4 schools, I think, has a legitimate chance to get into the college football playoff. Let's go through the conference. Let's talk about it in October and November. But isn't it interesting Where's that money going to go if one of those teams gets in?
Yeah.
It's going to go to Oregon State and Washington State. You go through the basketball season and there's tournament money. Where's that money going to go? That's going to go to Oregon State and Washington State. Where are the tournament shares for the next 6 years that this conference has earned? Where are those going? Into the coffers of Oregon State and Washington State.
Yeah, well, and that's what I think they're fighting for.
That's the money that we're talking about right now.
Yeah, and I think, Washington State, with the debt load they have, needs the money. I mean, you got to be able to dig out from that, and I think that's what's tough. Like, again, like, everyone can appreciate the concept of, hey, you have debt. Like, it makes it harder. It makes things more difficult, and I think that, I would be fighting for my life too if I were these two schools. I would be dying on this hill big time, and I think that they have a really strong case.
I think this is history in the making, because if this conference, even in name alone, survives, this is a win for the little guy. This is a win for the underdog. Mm-hmm. This is a win for the perennial black sheep of the conference in Washington State.
Yeah.
Who, by the way, has a football team that's winning games, right? You would rarely see this. You would rarely see this. It's far more that you see the Florida States trying to break up a conference. It's far more that you see the Michigans and the Ohio States dominating a conference. When do you see the nothings, the dregs, the lower level, with all due respect, universities in a conference? This would be Indiana football. This would be Illinois, Maryland, or Rutgers telling Ohio State and Michigan where to go.
Yeah.
Like, when do you ever see Vanderbilt telling Alabama a goddamn thing?
Uh-huh.
Right? You don't. And that's why this is so shocking.